Welcome to CAM Look, your daily dose of the Cincinnati Art Museum. Each weekday, a staff member or volunteer will be sharing an object from the permanent collection and posing questions for discussion. Please check back at 10 a.m. every day for a new work and a new conversation. My name is Andrea Gutmann Fuentes, and I am a member of the Ohio History Service Corps, an AmeriCorps program dedicated to building capacity for local history organizations throughout Ohio, and I'm currently serving at the Cincinnati Art Museum. For today's CAM Look, we'll be hearing from Nick Keeling, who has been doing research on Jacob Schmidlapp's Model Homes Company, which provided quality homes for working families in Walnut Hills in the early 20th century. You may recognize Schmidlapp's name from the Cincinnati Art Museum's Schmidlapp Wing. In this video, we'll think about how Schmidlapp's philanthropy impacted the city as a whole, and Walnut Hills in particular, as someone who is interested in both supporting art institutions such as CAM, as well as the livelihood of working families.
I'm Nick Keeling. I'm a resident of Cincinnati. I live in West Price Hill, and I focus a lot of my independent studies and research around the history of race in Cincinnati and how it relates to modern day policy. We're at the site of one of America's most influential and one of the first housing projects to provide affordable housing to the masses, especially to what they called the low wage earner, basically someone who was employed but still had a very low income and was unable to afford standard housing market rates. It's also one of the first projects in United States history that followed a comprehensive plan. This community here is called Washington Terrace. There were 600 families housed here at full occupancy for many decades. This was 1910s. These houses were still segregated. Most of the cities of Cincinnati experienced segregation, but the housing itself was affordable, and a majority of the houses was provided to black residents, which was an antithesis even to public housing projects that would happen 20 years later. The person that would be the main champion of this project was a man by the name of Jacob G. Schmidlapp, a very wealthy man in the city of Cincinnati that gained his wealth through distilling, and basically was one of Cincinnati's most influential wealthy people at the time. Jacob Schmidlapp did experience a pretty hard time in his life, losing his daughters and his wife, I believe, to accidents and disease. And he dedicated the ending years of his life to philanthropy.
For example, the Schmidlapp Wing at the Cincinnati Art Museum was made possible by a donation from Jacob Schmidlapp, dedicated to his deceased daughter, Emma Louise. It was the first addition made to the original 1886 museum building. The Emma Louise Schmidlapp Memorial Building opened in 1907 and originally served as the museum's statuary hall, but Jacob Schmidlapp wanted to direct his philanthropy beyond the ivory tower to impact the daily lives of working people in the city. This led him to establish the Cincinnati Model Homes Company in 1911.
At the time in the country, substandard housing was a very commonality in urban environments. The progressive movement was just beginning to provide an adequate house for everyone. Schmidlapp was certainly influenced by these types of policies, and he would build these homes between the 1910s to the 1920s. Jacob Schmidlapp chose this land specifically because at the time none of this was here. This was mostly farmland. And this was, as they say, picturesque hills and views. Each one of these buildings could provide a decent standard of living for every tenant and still be competitive with the tenements downtown. In fact, the housing here is actually cheaper than what the tenements were downtown. The housing policy for these homes instituted by Jacob Schmidlapp was to provide the highest standard of living for of course, the cheapest price possible, and the rent was set for each person basically as 1 day's wage for 1 week's rent. And basically that meant that one person in each one of these units had to be a low-income wage earner. Often that was the man of the family, because there is factory employment on the other side of this valley right here, such as the Coca-Cola plant. And that meant that one person would have to pay rent, and that was even unheard of by tenements, where often many tenements would have to pay rent into just one room. These homes are built in the way that there is surface level entrance on the front and rear of each one of these buildings. Each one of these buildings has 4 units, and each unit has 2 bedrooms, 1 kitchen, and that kitchen also has a bathroom inside of it, and then also a living room. At the time, this was revolutionary compared to tenements that were located in the West End, where there was up to 12 people per 1 room. Providing the entrances on the floor was done on purpose. As you can tell, there is 4 doors at the beginning of each unit. There's not a common area in the middle where all the units share. The reason for that was that Schmidlapp believed that this is a community-based plan. He wanted either the tenements to be in their units or on basically in the middle of the community, outside, embracing things. It wasn't just a residential development. At the basis of the valley, there was a 200-person meeting hall called the Annex, and in that was a place for tenants to meet, either it be for recreation, meeting halls. On Sunday, it was used as a church for the Mount Zion Hope Baptist Church. The grocery store was run by a resident of the community, and he would receive a portion of the profits. The rest of the profits were split up as dividends and given back to residents. And so that was proven to be a very successful form of community building and was praised by one of the most important people that would write about the Cincinnati Model Homes Company, W.E.B. Du Bois, and was considered to be something that should be replicated in many other communities. One thing they did have that was unique to the Cincinnati Model Homes Company is that they had men and women's clubs, and that is basically a form of tenant unions that they required each tenant to be a part of once they were an adult. And these would basically write out their own grievances. They would vote democratically on these things, and they would send these grievances to the board of directors of the Cincinnati Model Homes Company, where they would have a decision based upon this. The women's organization was able to basically submit many letters asking for things such as the church, so they could rent the annex on Sundays to be used as a church. They also wanted to promote the use of a milk station, and this would be the second only milk station in the entire city of Cincinnati. The basis for that was that providing healthy milk to babies would lower the death rate significantly, and so Jacob Schmidlapp and the board approved of that. And that's another reason why the Cincinnati Model Homes Company had a very low death rate in comparison to the rest of the city. Behind me is Interstate 71. And at the basis of this was the Washington Terrace Annex that had both the co-op grocery store, the 200-person meeting hall, the milk station, and also a public grounds that was basically a park that would provide a cooperative vegetable garden. And in the middle of that gardens that was provided on these, at the time, beautiful hills, there was also a statue of Jacob Schmidlapp that would be erected in front of the Washington Terrace Annex gardens. The statue that was erected in the basis of Washington Terrace Annex was very similar to the bust in the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection. The statue was the centerpiece, or one of the centerpieces of the community, but obviously the co-op grocery store and the meeting halls were the ones that always had praise from most people, and those are the ones that have left the greatest amount of impact on housing policy to this day. The project was studied in many different forms, in forms such as social economics, community impact. It would compare basically all different forms of livability of their community and would compare and contrast it with the city of Cincinnati. And everything that was supposed to improve did improve. So crime rates for the Cincinnati Model Homes Company were 1/12 of the city of Cincinnati average. The death rates were also 0.1% lower than the city's national average. Of course, having the public milk station and the Washington Terrace Annex were wonderful added bonuses. Currently, my research is in regards to what happened to the Cincinnati Model Homes Company between the death of Jacob Schmidlapp in 1919 and the organization's dissolving in 1977. A majority of the housing stock was destroyed in the early 1960s for the construction of Interstate 71 through the heart of the Washington Terrace Annex, essentially killing most of the project. The rest of the community that surrounded the project was either quickly abandoned, sold off to private developers, or sold off to housing and urban development. By this time, most of the original mission of the Cincinnati Model Homes Company was forgotten. The remaining housing stock was slowly decaying and was abandoned, and the final housing is right behind me. This is just the last bit of units that provided housing for over 600 families. A great portion of the housing development was destroyed in the early 2010s from orders by HUD. The purpose of that order was because of noise ordinances. Again, it should be noted that these houses were built in the 1910s, and the interstate was built not until 50 years later. And so the interstate had clear priority over the sanctity of these homes. Another thing that should be noted was that these buildings were still segregated at the times. A majority of the housing was provided for black residents, but by the 1930s and 40s, all the housing was integrated, and that's when the housing was truly slated to be demolished.
I hope you enjoyed hearing about the Cincinnati Art Museum's unlikely connection to the Cincinnati Model Homes Company through one of our most important historical supporters, Jacob Schmidlapp. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's CAM Look, and we'll see you back tomorrow for another one.